Michael, thank you so much for joining us for this chat. It's a bit surreal for me, having done a lot of events and engagements with you. You typically the interviewer or the host or the MC. So to be sitting here where I'm normally behind the scenes, being able to grill you with a couple of questions is feels like quite a change to our usual setup. But thank you very much for coming and being part of this and for discussing David Buckham and Robin Wilkinson's latest book, The Spell.
Yep.
Pleasure to have you here and to unpack some of the themes of the book.
Steve, thanks so much. As you say, with the glint in your eye, I think you've probably been wanting to get me into this particular corner for a while. I must say, for me as well, not often I'm on this side of the interview equation, but it's fantastic to be here, to be part of the project, and having been involved in previous books that David has written and launched. It's quite incredible to see how he and Robin have built this rapport in the way they can churn out really dense, well-researched, sweeping narratives in such a short space of time. And I found it gripping kind of from start to finish. So I'm looking forward to talk about it.
Excellent. Well, I'll make a point of trying to make it as difficult as I can for you. Starting out with, I guess, not the easiest question to answer. You as a journalist, I guess one of the fundamental challenges is that you've got this world with so many different narratives, so many different versions of the truth, and you need to try and internalize some kind of objective perspective and relay that to the general public. How do you go about dealing with such a task?
Especially in a post-truth society that we live in today, where, well, I think the big challenge, and I'm starting at a very high level and broadly for journalism, is how to remain relevant in a world where, with the rise of social media and X and all of the big tech platforms that have come in and started hoovering the revenue from traditional newsrooms, is how do you stay relevant? And really what fundamentally changed in the model is that people could be citizen journalists. They could tweet from the scene of anything, and everyone's got an opinion. And so really what distinguishes you in that environment is the ability to filter and fact check. So the one thing that kind of legacy or traditional media had as its core strength soon became a weakness, in that in order to fact check, you would send a junior reporter. When I started out, you'd go and maybe as a financial reporter, you'd read a SENS article, then you'd go through some annual reports, you'd open an old Metro file cabinet, you'd pull out the files on the company that go back to its very first listing date, and you would have time to build a story and then to send it to a proofreader, a sub-editor, copy editor, and there's this natural filtering hierarchy and pyramid before it finally got printed. That whole pyramid was really inverted and turned on its head. And so, you know, with the ability to tweet instantly, to have an opinion instantly, what now became the great strength of journalism was a weakness in that we became a bit slow. And so what I have seen in response to that is this desire to be quick and to be first. I like to think of the old model as now our strength, actually, which is a kind of counterintuitive to think. But if you think about what people are looking for, they're looking for trust, they're looking for credibility, and they're looking for that objectivity. Where can they find truth in a world where we have all of the agendas, all of this post-truth narrative pushing out there? And that's where media that goes through the process of fact-checking, having someone else and then a third pair of eyes over what you've written and over what you've said, it does build in a certain sense of reflection and self-reflection and objectivity. Now, I'll come back to objectivity because I think it's actually a very loaded word, very difficult to be objective in the world today because we all bring our subjective worldviews. And in Journalism 101, I think I prefer to read media where I know where they're coming from, like The Economist might be a little bit center left to some, or if you go to Fox, you're going far right. If you go into The Guardian, you're going all the way to the left. But at least you know where you're coming from. But back to how you remain objective So I think that inherent strength of the traditional media has a built-in filtration process that develops greater objectivity, at least a greater sense of getting the truth and speaking to more than one person, using 3 or 4 sources in an article rather than unnamed sources. All of those are journalistic tools that are hammered home in university journalism 1, 2, and 3. And we had started to drift away from that when social media first arrived. But I see the media that are surviving and thriving are the traditional media that do this very well. And I mentioned The Economist. It's one that can wash its own face just with subscribers alone. It doesn't really need even much advertising, even though it does have a lot of advertising. The FT is another. And these are examples of media that, you know, really abide by that old journalistic maxim of checking it thrice. And so that helps build in a bit of systemic objectivity. But then every journalist is going to bring their own view, their own upbringing, their own personal heuristics and biases. And I think as a journalist, you're constantly aware of those and you're constantly trying to confront those in the way you write. And it is a muscle that you exercise effectively. So, I mean, in a nutshell, I think it's very difficult to do, extremely hard to do if you're not trained to do it. And why I think increasingly the public are going back to traditional media because they can trust that you're not professionals. I mean, journalists are not professionals. We tradespeople effectively. And my grandfather still said to me, why the hell are you going to study a degree to go and write stories about things? But you do have some degree of training, more than a typical kind of citizen journalist would. And I think increasingly that's becoming, you know, widely known and appreciated.
And are we better off or worse off in a world of AI?
Well, I think, and I'm going to be a typical economist here, on the one hand and on the other. I think on the one hand, if you're talking about AI used to create efficiencies and automate processes for small businesses who are wearing many different hats and allowing them the ability to be more efficient and to compete with bigger players in the market, I think absolutely we're better off. And I think what AI does is it does democratize access to those tools. Where I think we are underestimating the perils of AI is probably in the ability of this technology to replace typically junior level entrance into the workforce. And whereas previous industrial revolutions disrupted blue collar work, this is disrupting white collar work. So if you talk to an article clerk, someone who's doing articles at a law firm as well, or you know, just anyone in a professional services capacity where there was lots of retrieval knowledge work going and looking at case law, all of a sudden that can be done by AI and much more effectively because of that cognitive compute power that it has as an advantage. So I think we need to be very mindful of then how do we, in the professions, ensure that there are pathways for learning and we don't start hollowing out the professions and giving away too much to the technology. Because I think in our haste to do that, we might then create problems down the line. And also as a third point of concern is probably cybersecurity and cyber risk. I mean, I was emceeing at the IT Web Security Summit recently, and there were examples where they can clone your voice, they can feed it into a large language model, and they can spoof you into giving away key information. You think you're chatting to your mom or your sister, or maybe not someone as close because you might pick up a little bit more of the inferences, but a colleague, and you're giving away keys to, you know, to the company vault, for example. And I think that really does frighten me. And the fact that it seems the bad actors are using the technology and leading into it a bit more than we can actually build, you know, defenses against.
Absolutely. With this lens of trying to understand the world, and as you said, objectivity is a loaded word at the moment. This book really tries to unpack, going through history, these different truths, these different narratives. In you exploring this book and trying to take something personally from it, how has it been different from the previous books that David and Robin have written? And is there something you personally have found useful having gone through the content?
Yeah, well, I think it's part history, part philosophy, part cultural commentary. And if you look at the grand sweep of the book, initially, just when you flip through the very short chapters, you think, wow, I mean, how are they going to connect all of these things? But I think what they've done, and they've shown us in the past, both of these authors, the ability to connect what can be very dense philosophical commentary from Nietzsche and Foucault, but they weave it through these allegorical stories around superheroes, around mythology, Live Aid. They've got these very relevant, very current stories that help us understand these very dense philosophical existential questions of humanity. And to the book subtitle, How the West Lost Its Soul. What I really took from the book is, and it's something that I picked up in orthogonal thinking, David's thoughts around these big idea trains and these grand narratives that we have, and how susceptible we are to accepting a narrative if it's been accepted as, say, capitalism is the only way or communism is the only way, as a gospel truth. And if we go back in history, we realize that, the only thing that history guarantees is that, it doesn't rhyme, but it repeats. And we tend to repeat these mistakes over and over. And I think where the book really rises and shines is it lifts these things to the surface and it puts them out in the cold light of day for us to then pore over. And I didn't agree with everything, but I'm sure we'll come to some of those later on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so do you think there's anything from this book that's perhaps changed your perception on history or philosophy?
You know what I found really interesting is right at the end of the book, David talks about the kind of Jungian view of dreams and also of art and artifacts, and how often what we do subconsciously in our art, and movie making is art, book writing is art, is we bring to the surface things that are existential to our survival as a species. And I think, it may sound a little bit airy-fairy, but the way he then tied that through to the zombie narrative that we created and how it preceded COVID, and with eerie accuracy can really describe, that whole COVID period where, we had just absolutely lost our minds against this virus sweeping across the world. So it made me want to revisit psychology beyond the kind of pop psychology that we're flooded with today. And again, I grew up in a household, Stephen, where my dad was very blue-collar, working class. I'm very much pro-markets, pro-capitalism, because I've had to pull myself up from my bootstraps. I waited tables to pay my way through university, worked hard, got to a position where, and I know there's white privilege, and when we talk about this in South Africa, anyone watching this might say, come on, Michael, you're white, you were privileged. But there's a myth there as well that all white people were privileged. We had it rough. There were certain periods where the church had to bring groceries over to the house when my dad lost his business because there was no money to put food on the table. Yeah. So I had to work to pay my own way through university, and so I believed in capitalism as a system. But parts of the book do start make you I started to question just how tethered I am to that system ideologically, and do I question it enough, and whose interests it serves? Yes. Because there's a lot of that in the book about power and how power is used in the Irish famine, for example, to almost exterminate the Irish population, and in various other examples of how there's this hypocrisy built into capitalism. We'll get into bed with the Saudi prince after what he did to Kamal Khashoggi. So there's that tension that just makes you sit a little uncomfortably within your own preconceived views of the world. And I appreciate that, because that's ultimately why we read, isn't it? Yes. We don't just want to read something that's going to confirm what we already know. Otherwise, I'd pick up Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. Yeah. I think one of the narratives in the book that particularly made me feel that sense of uncomfort is, and it's through history where
the privileged or the developed countries claim to try be helping or supporting developing nations. And as a South African who lives in a third world country, you perhaps get a better sense of what does and doesn't work. And throughout history, there's been unforeseen consequences where help has been given, but the end result isn't what the desired objective was. Do you believe there's a way we should be changing the support system that developed countries provide developing countries?
Yeah.
And how do you think we should progress and see that kind of partnership to uplift the global society?
And it's so important. I just think, before I answer that, if you look at what's happened in the world pre-COVID, it was starting to build up. The Brexit pressures, the sense that the global south is starting to rise, largely through China and 500 million people going from agrarian subsistence into the lower to upper to middle income earning status, and how the West, who is already there, you can't really go that much higher relative to that great rebalancing. And there's an economist by the name of Branko Milanovic who's developed the very famous elephant graph, and it just shows how those incomes equalizing around the world were actually a necessary precondition for global prosperity, and this idea that globalization can lift all boats. But very quickly, populist leaders in the West, think Farage, think Trump, Orban, jumped on this disaffection in their local populaces that globalization hadn't benefited them, and they used it to rise to power politically. And so I think there needs to be greater awareness of that global geopolitical story when you then start thinking as developed countries or the West as to how you give a lift up to the developing countries. And it has to be done in a way that is seen to be more, I think, mutually beneficial on a sustainable basis, and not just to say, right, we'll come in and we'll support a few local industrialists with soft loans tied to DFIs, for example, and then we'll leave, because that just leaves a simmering discontent behind. And the other big thing for me is there has to be real skills and capital transfer and know-how. It's the old story of teach a man to fish. And there's been far too much financial transfers or doing deals around minerals. And it remains a kind of pit-to-port extractive model in Africa, where the large population of these countries are not beneficiaries of those programs. But if you start to focus on early childhood development, getting nutrition right, and there's a big component around nutrition and eugenics in the book, but getting that right and then feeding it into real quality education, then you start to lay the foundations for an Africa that can make use of these tools in a positive way, these AI tools, and not be subject to the designers of the tools and the algorithms as we have in previous industrial revolutions.
Yeah, the other very polarizing narrative is around climate change. And we now, stemming from this conversation about the developed relationship with the developing, we now ending up in a situation where you have laws like CBAM coming in that can be seen as controversial, and whether or not developing countries should be held to the same level of scrutiny as developed countries when it comes to how we manage climate change. What about this narrative has made it so tricky to unpack and agree what the right thing is to do?
Yeah, and there's this quote here, and I loved, the climate change part of the book is an important part of understanding these grand narratives. And this is where I think David and Robin don't hold back, arguing that the narrative has slipped from science on the one hand into the realm of politics. And if you look at just the way the IPCC's language has escalated over time, from admitting in 1990 that the unequivocal detection of the human enhanced greenhouse effect is not likely for a decade or more, to declaring a code red for humanity in its 6th assessment report. Now, I think the valid point here is also that if you keep on shouting apocalypse, that you lose the impact of your message. But where I might disagree is that, yes, it's important to analyze the rhetoric, but I think the effects of climate change are pretty much self-evident if you look at the coral bleachings around the world, if you look at the soil erosion, the biodiversity loss. The question that we have to grapple with is who pays as we try and redesign our modern capitalist systems. And this is where various IPCC or COP meetings have really not delivered, because you've got the global south demanding that those who've benefited through the use of fossil fuels in various industrial revolutions are not prepared to pay, while they're asking or imposing through CBAM the developing world to forego those very same benefits of access to very cheap, low-cost energy. And while we can argue that renewable power is indeed low cost when you tie it to batteries and at scale for big industrial processes, it is still not nearly as effective as those old methods are.
Sure.
And so that's the knotty challenge, right? But I think we lose that when we get bogged down in very apocalyptic doomsday type narratives where the Greta Thunbergs of this world declare the world's going to cease to exist by 2030, which is just patent nonsense. But I'm finding hope in that the developing world is becoming a bit more avuncular and a bit more muscular in pushing back. And that's certainly what we've seen with arguments around loss and damage funds and who ultimately pays for this. But again, it's one of those provocative parts of the book that just leaves you wanting to engage more and wanting to pick up the phone and say to David, I disagree here, but I absolutely have you on the other point now.
Yes, and I guess the book, through its form of storytelling, takes us through from ancient Rome days, the progression of society and humanity. And I guess, some could call it progression, some could call it evolution. Do you believe that as a society, perhaps looking back in the past 50 years, that we are progressing and the global society is moving forward? Or do you think there's some areas where we're just letting ourselves down?
So I worry. I do worry. I think humanity and globalization is at an inflection point, and we're seeing that in the politics of the moment and how we're pushing back this anti-immigrant sentiment that we see around the world, the rise of populism, this pushback against globalization, and with Donald Trump taking us back to this very neo-mercantilist 1930s period where it's very zero-sum, it's you win, I lose, you've benefited more from globalization, so you're going to have X tariff. It's very unscientific as well. And so I worry from that perspective, where I think we need a bit more perspective on how far we've come is if you just look at global poverty rates, global mortality rates, all of our living indices, we're living longer, better, more fruitful, more productive lives. Overall, yes, I do think, again, back to the social media and the AI element, there was a very interesting study in the FT recently about how isolated we've become as a species, how much more we're using technology to replace human interaction and human connection, particularly with the younger generations. And I think the impact of this technology is yet to be truly felt.
Sure.
And where we, I think, really need to reflect very, very deeply about where we're going is how we move to a far more multipolar and accepting world, accepting of other cultures and other ways of doing things, because I think we're regressing on that perspective. I think we're very much becoming insular and isolated around cultural identity lines, which in a world that is increasingly interconnected through travel, through trade, raises all kinds of risks. So I'm concerned. I think if you were to say, where are we on a clock, a doomsday clock to World War III, I'd probably say we're at 10 minutes to midnight.
Sure. That's quite a statement to make. as we head towards the end of this discussion. I guess I've got one last question for you. Is if you had one reason why someone should read this book, what would it be?
Well, it holds up a mirror. It holds up a mirror to where we are in this current moment. And I think it holds up a mirror in such a way that it's not going to be flattering, it's not going to be filtered, but it's going to be honest. And I think if for no other reason, one needs to strip away as much as we can the various agendas of the grand narratives out there, because this is a moment for honesty and true reflection and leadership. And I think we all have a role to play within our communities, within our family structures, but then more broadly in the occupations and the positions we occupy in work and broader society, to show some kind of leadership, because many of these challenges are so knotty that no one leader is going to be able to solve them on their own.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think because of that, it allows us to have these sort of conversations where we don't necessarily have the right answers here and now, but we can discuss it, we can engage, we can try and have a debate about where we should be moving. And as you say, take on that sense of leadership and ownership in our individual lives. Michael, thank you very much. It's been brilliant to talk to you about this. And looking forward to discussing some more of the themes from the spell.
Yeah, cannot wait, and looking forward to the launch as well.
Excellent. Thank you.
Cheers.